You are a mere paper pusher, Nox. Don't dare speak in a room full of real warriors. If you can get that drive and clear my name, I will leave this uniform behind and marry you.
In the hallowed halls of the Naval Command, a silver star is a mark of godhood, and a clerk's stripes are a badge of invisibility. Commander Sloane rules her intelligence empire with an iron fist, never suspecting that the man she treats as dirt, the silent logistics clerk, Knox, is a ghost from a past she couldn't possibly understand. While the elite play their political games of power and prestige, a shadow is rising from the depths of the ranks. When a conspiracy threatens to destroy Sloane's life and brand her a traitor, the high-status world she loves turns its back on her. In the darkness of a rain-soaked hangar, the Queen of Intelligence must beg the man she humiliated for a second chance. But Knox isn't just a clerk. He is the deadliest weapon the military ever tried to bury. The air in the Navy Intelligence Command briefing room was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Commander Sloane stood at the head of the mahogany table, her spine as straight as a bayonet. Her raven hair was pulled so tight into a bun, it seemed to sharpen the predatory angle of her cheekbones. Before her stood Knox, a man she considered a stain on her pristine department. He held a stack of inventory reports, his olive drab uniform looking dull against the sea of polished gold and deep blues. To Sloane, he was nothing more than a failed soldier hiding behind a desk. The silence in the room was a weapon, and Sloane knew exactly how to wield it. She snatched the folder from Knox's hands and tossed it onto the table without looking at it. Her gray eyes scanned the elite officers gathered around her, before settling on the silent man. She began to speak, her voice cutting through the quiet like a serrated blade. Every word was designed to strip him of the little dignity he had left. She mocked the way he walked, the way he stood, and the low-level stripes on his sleeve. The officers laughed softly, a sound that felt like sandpaper against the soul. Sloane leaned in closer until she could see the reflection of her own arrogance in Knox's steady gray eyes. She told him that men like him were the reason operations failed, because they lacked the fire of true warriors. She called him a ghost of a man, a paper pusher who was lucky to even breathe the same air as elite operators. Knox did not blink or shift his weight as the insults rained down. He stood in a perfect parade rest, his face a mask of granite and stoicism. Sloane took a step back, her lip curling in a display of pure professional disgust. She pointed toward the door and told him to return to the basement where he belonged. She claimed that the only thing he was fit to protect was a box of stationery. Knox nodded once, a slow and deliberate movement that showed no sign of anger or resentment. He turned on his heel with a precision that should have tipped her off to his past. He marched out of the room, leaving the echoes of their laughter behind him. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and Sloane felt a momentary surge of triumph. She believed she had asserted her dominance and kept her unit pure of perceived weakness. She returned to the digital display at the front of the room, ready to launch the most important mission of her career. The mission was Operation Nightfall, a deep cover extraction of a high-level encryption drive. She had handpicked the best men in the fleet to execute the task. Her promotion to admiral was practically guaranteed if this succeeded. Hours later, the mood in the command center shifted from confidence to cold terror. The screens began to flicker with red warning lights as the communications link to the extraction team went dark. Sloane stood frozen, her hand hovering over the intercom as the sounds of gunfire and static filled the room. Her elite team was being hunted in the desert, and there was no backup in range. The data feed showed a massive breach in their secure server, coming from within the base. Someone had sold them out, and the evidence was being planted in her private files. The admiral walked into the room, his face pale and his voice trembling with hidden rage. He looked at Sloane not as a protege, but as a liability and a potential traitor. He informed her that an internal investigation had already begun regarding the leak. Sloane felt the walls of her world beginning to crumble into dust. Her men were dying, and her honor was being stripped away in real time. She realized with a sinking heart that she was being set up as the fall girl for a massive conspiracy. She fled the command center, her polished heels clicking frantically against the sterile floor. She needed someone who wasn't on the grid, someone the conspirators wouldn't be watching. As she reached the rain-soaked parking lot, she saw a lone figure walking toward a rusted truck. It was Knox, his shoulders square against the downpour, his gait steady and calm. He was the only person who didn't owe her a thing, and the only one she had truly wronged. The rain soaked through her expensive dress uniform as she ran toward him. Sloane reached out and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the hard muscle beneath his utility shirt. She was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of her impending ruin. Knox stopped and turned, looking at her with a gaze that was neither warm nor cold. It was the look of a hunter who had seen everything and feared nothing. Sloane tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat as she realized the depth of her desperation. She was the queen of intelligence, and she was currently a beggar. She told him everything through broken breaths and the sound of falling rain. She told him that her team was gone and that her name would be dragged through the mud by morning. Knox listened in total silence, his face illuminated by the flickering yellow light of a nearby street lamp. He didn't offer sympathy or a shoulder to cry on. He simply watched her, his presence a solid anchor in the middle of her personal hurricane. Sloane realized that this man was her only chance at survival. The desperation finally broke her pride, and she made a choice that would change both their lives. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a raw honesty she had never shown anyone. She made a vow that felt like a reckless leap off a cliff. She promised him that if he could find the drive and save her life, she would give up everything. She would leave her rank, her family's legacy, and her world to be his wife. It was a challenge born of terror and a strange sudden recognition of his strength. Knox reached out and gently removed her hand from his arm. For the first time he spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the humid air. He didn't accept the marriage proposal yet, but he didn't reject it either. He told her to go to her quarters and lock the door until he came for her. He walked toward the back of his truck and pulled out a heavy black tactical case. As he opened it, the light glinted off the cold steel of a customized assault rifle. The rain turned into a torrential downpour as Sloane stood alone in the shadow of the hangar, watching Knox transform before her eyes. The slouching logistics clerk was gone, replaced by a man whose every movement was a symphony of lethal efficiency. He didn't look at her as he checked the chamber of his sidearm, his hands moving with a speed that spoke of thousands of hours of muscle memory. Sloane felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the weather as she realized she had spent months mocking a predator. The silence between them was no longer one of submissiveness, but of a warrior preparing for a hunt. She followed him into the dim light of the equipment shed, her breath hitching in her chest as she saw the array of gear he pulled from the floorboards of his truck. There were encrypted comms units, thermobaric charges, and a jagged combat knife that looked like it had seen years of service. Sloane reached out to touch a jagged scar on his forearm, but he pulled away, focusing entirely on the mission at hand. She felt the sting of her previous insults echoing in her mind like a physical weight. Every sharp word she had ever thrown at him now felt like a debt she could never fully repay. Knox finally looked up, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her knees weak for a reason she couldn't explain. He told her that the men who framed her were already moving to secure the crash site in the high desert. He explained that her elite team had been walked into a kill zone because their tactical signatures were too loud and too predictable. Sloane realized then that he had been watching her operations from the sidelines and identifying every flaw she had overlooked. Her arrogance had been her blindfold, and Knox was the only one who could see the truth in the dark. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling that the military police were closing in on her position. Sloane gripped Knox's tactical vest, her knuckles turning white as the reality of her career suicide set in. She whispered, "They would brand her a traitor by dawn if the drive wasn't recovered and the true leaker exposed." Knox didn't flinch at the sound of the approaching sirens as he slung a suppressed rifle over his shoulder. He looked at her and asked if she truly understood the weight of the promise she had made him in the rain. Sloane stepped into his personal space, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She told him that she didn't care about the gold on her shoulders anymore because it had brought her nothing but betrayal. She swore again that if he brought her back from this ledge, she would belong to him and him alone. She promised to leave the high society of the capital and the politics of the Pentagon to follow him wherever he went. It was a reckless, emotional gamble, but in that moment, she felt more alive than she had in years. Knox reached out and placed a heavy, gloved hand on the side of her neck, his thumb tracing her jawline. The touch was firm and possessive, a silent acknowledgement of the claim she had just offered him. He told her to stay in the shadows of the old airfield and wait for his signal on an encrypted frequency. He promised her that he would not only find the drive, but he would bring her the head of the man who sold her out. Before she could respond, he vanished into the darkness of the tree line, leaving her alone with the fading sound of sirens. For the next 6 hours, Sloane sat in the corner of a rusted hangar, clutching a handheld radio to her chest. She watched the news on a small portable monitor, seeing her own face labeled as a fugitive and a person of interest. Her family's prestigious name was being dragged through the dirt, and her former allies were already distancing themselves from the scandal. She felt a profound sense of isolation that she had never known in her ivory tower. The only thing keeping her from falling into total despair was the occasional burst of static from the radio. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and she heard the sound of heavy breathing and the rhythmic thud of distant explosions. Knox's voice came through the speaker, calm and steady, as if he were merely reading a weather report. He told her that he had reached the crash site and that the recovery was underway, a realization of just how dangerous the man she had insulted truly was. As the sun began to peak over the horizon, Sloane heard the low hum of an approaching engine. A blacked-out tactical vehicle drifted into the hangar, its tires kicking up dust and grit. The door opened, and Knox stepped out, his olive-drab uniform now stained with oil and dark red blood. He looked exhausted, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on her. In his hand he held a small titanium-cased drive, the silver surface glinting in the morning light. He walked toward her without saying a word, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. He stopped inches away from her and held out the drive, his hand steady despite the chaos he had just survived. Sloane didn't take the drive immediately. Instead, she looked at the man who had risked everything for a woman who had treated him like trash. She saw the dust on his brow and the tension in his shoulders, and felt a wave of genuine humility wash over her. She realized that she didn't just need him to save her career, she needed him to save her soul. The arrogance of the commander was gone, replaced by the vulnerability of a woman in love. Knox pressed the drive into her hand and told her that the evidence of the Admiral's treason was all there. He told her that she could go back now and reclaim her life and her rank and forget the promise she made in the rain. He turned to walk away, as if he expected her to choose the world of power over him. Sloane felt a sharp panic at the thought of him disappearing back into the shadows of the logistics department. She realized that the thought of a life without his silent strength was more terrifying than any court-martial. She reached out and caught the hem of his jacket, pulling him back toward her with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She told him that she was a woman of her word, and that her life as Commander Sloan ended the moment he stepped into the line of fire for her. She looked him in the eye and told him that she was ready to start their life together right then and there. Knox paused, and a small ghost of a smile touched his lips for the first time. He pulled her into a fierce embrace as the sound of the morning sun began to burn away the fog. The heavy double doors of the National Security Council burst open as Sloan marched into the room, with Knox walking 3 paces behind her. The room was filled with high-ranking generals and the admiral who had orchestrated her downfall, all of whom froze at the sight of the woman they thought was in hiding. Sloan did not look like the broken fugitive they expected. She wore her dress uniform with a new kind of ferocity. Her eyes were fixed on the admiral, who sat at the head of the table, sipping coffee, as if he had already won. Knox remained a silent shadow, his presence ignored by the elite, who still saw only a lowly clerk. The admiral stood up with a fake expression of pity and told Sloan she was making a mistake by showing her face before her arrest. He looked at Knox and sneered, asking why she had brought the janitor to a meeting of the minds. The other officers chuckled, but the sound died quickly when Sloan slammed the titanium encryption drive onto the center of the table. She told them that the game was over and that every digital footprint of their treason was locked inside that casing. The admiral's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he realized his private server had been breached by someone he didn't even recognize. One of the elite tactical commanders stepped forward and tried to seize the drive by force, his hand moving towards his holster. Before he could even unbutton the strap, Knox moved with a speed that left the room gasping in collective shock. In a single fluid motion, Knox had the commander's arm pinned behind his back, and a blade pressed against the man's jugular. The room fell into a deathly silence as the high-status officers looked at the clerk and saw the cold eyes of a Tier 1 operator. Knox told them in a low, gravelly voice that no one would be touching the evidence until the military police arrived. Sloan watched the scene with a mixture of pride and a deep, aching regret for how she had once treated him. She addressed the council and revealed Knox's true identity as the lead breacher of the legendary Black Ops Unit 7, whose records had been sealed for national security. She told them that the man they had mocked for months was the only reason they were still sitting in a free country. The officers who had laughed at Knox in the briefing room now looked down at their laps, unable to meet his steady gray gaze. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably, and the lowly man was now the master of the floor. The admiral tried to scramble for an excuse, but the evidence on the monitors began to play, revealing his secret bank accounts and communications with the insurgents. As the military police entered the room to take the conspirators into custody, the admiral looked at Sloan and begged for her to be reasonable. He reminded her of her family's legacy and the high society life she would lose if she pursued this scandal to the end. Sloan looked at the man who represented everything she used to value and felt nothing but a cold, distant disgust. She told him that she had found something far more valuable than a seat at his table. She turned to Knox, who had released the commander and was standing calmly by the window, watching the sunrise. She walked over to him, and in front of the entire assembly of generals, she began to unpin the gold medals from her chest. One by one, the symbols of her rank hit the floor with a metallic wing that echoed through the silent chamber. She removed her officer's cap and let her raven hair fall loose around her shoulders for the first time in years. The council watched in stunned silence as the most promising commander in the Navy walked away from her career. Knox looked at the pile of gold on the floor, and then back at the woman who had once called him a ghost of a man. He asked her if she was sure about walking away from the power and the prestige she had worked her whole life to earn. Sloan stepped closer to him and took his rough, scarred hand in hers. squeezing it with a firm and certain grip. She told him that the only rank she cared about now was being the woman by his side in whatever life they built together. She saw the mask of the stoic soldier finally cracked as Knox looked at her with an expression of pure, raw devotion. They walked out of the Pentagon together, leaving the chaos of the investigation and the flashing lights of the media behind them. As they reached the parking lot, the morning air felt clean and crisp, no longer heavy with the scent of secrets and lies. Knox opened the door of his rusted truck for her, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a step down for Sloane. It felt like an escape into a world where honor was measured by action rather than the color of a uniform. She realized that she had spent her life commanding men, but she had never known a man until she met Knox. The drive away from the city was quiet, but the silence was no longer filled with tension or judgment. They passed the outskirts of the military base where they had first met, and Sloane didn't even look back at the gates. She looked at Knox's profile as he drove, his hands steady on the wheel, and felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. He told her about a small piece of land he owned in the mountains, far away from the politics of the capital. He said it wasn't a palace, but it was a place where they could be whoever they wanted to be. Sloane leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the steady hum of the engine beneath her. She thought about the promise she had made in the rain and how it had seemed like a desperate lie at the time. Now she realized it was the most honest thing she had ever said in her entire professional life. She told him that a cabin in the mountains sounded like a kingdom to her as long as he was there to guard the door. Knox reached over and pulled her closer, his silent strength acting as the foundation for their new future. As the truck climbed higher into the hills, the world of intelligence and military operations faded into a distant blur. The people who had underestimated Knox would spend years talking about the clerk who took down an admiral and stole the heart of a commander. But for Knox and Sloane, those titles no longer mattered, as they left the hierarchy behind for something more permanent. They were no longer the queen and the grunt, but two souls who had found their truth in the middle of a war. The sun rose fully over the horizon, bathing the road ahead in a golden light of redemption. They pulled into a clearing overlooking a valley where the air was thin and the pine trees stood like silent sentinels. Knox stopped the truck and turned to her, pulling a simple silver ring from the pocket of his utility jacket. He didn't make a grand speech or kneel in the dirt, because his actions had already said everything that needed to be said. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Sloane felt the final piece of her old life fall away. She kissed him with a passion that was a vow in itself, proving that the greatest victory wasn't won on a battlefield, but in the heart.